Hello, I'm Jerry Vockley. I am the Chief of Genetic and Genomic Medicine here at Children's Hospital and the Director of the Center for Rare Disease Therapy. And I'm going to be talking this afternoon on the topic of clinical trials, why you care and why you should participate. And I also like to subtitle this, how do we know what we know? And you'll see where that comes from in a minute. This is, hang on a second, I'll get my, there we go. I always throw some disclosures up to get started. These are folks that fund me. I call them opportunities. The academic infrastructure calls them conflicts of interest. And I have some good collaborators here at the university. And I'm going to start off by introducing you to our Center for Rare Disease Therapy. This webinar is being presented as part of our celebration of Rare Disease Day, which I guess is officially Sunday, I think. So the Center for Rare Disease Therapy really was started a number of years ago now here at Children's with the idea that we by pulling together people with interests across disciplines in rare diseases that we'll be able to advance those therapies. We consist of a group of international experts that focus on treatment of children with rare diseases. We try to define leading standards of care, pioneer protocols, and establish a multidisciplinary collaboration that allows us to provide world-class therapy and individual services. It's been a very rewarding effort for us here at the center, and I know I see some of you on the webinar that have participated in our programs or been patients here at the center. This is our leadership group. Deanna Steele is our coordinator, excuse me, and a genetic counselor. And then those somewhat squashed people are Michelle Peters, who is one of our administrative leads, and Kate Lindholm, who helps us put together the website and takes care of our communications and marketing as we send things out to you all. So if someone's bugging you with emails, most likely it's Kate. Our medical team is quite diverse. You can see that I'm there, but we have folks from across the spectrum of disciplines here at Children's, including liver transplant, neurology, hepatology, rheumatology, ophthalmology, bone marrow transplant, cardiology. Let's see, who haven't I read there? Immunology, hematology, oncology, and nephrology. So we're quite diverse, and I'm not going to give you a list of the disorders that we have particular interest in. You can find those on our website, but we have a broad list that we have particular focus on. We've been doing these webinars now for what's it look like? Just over a year. Almost just under 2 years. Over 2 years. There's one from 2/5/2019. That was me. We've had folks from our faculty present, and some of our genetic counselors. You can see the list here. These are all online. So if you go to the Center for Rare Disease Therapy website, and you can just find that by Googling Center for Rare Disease Therapy, CHP. And you can plug in and watch these if you haven't had a chance to see them and you're interested. Contact information here. The email, the generic email to get to us is just rarecare@chp.edu, and that phone number there, 412-692-7273, will excuse me, will most likely get you Deanna or whoever's covering for her if she happens to be out of town or the office. And there is the link for the webinar there, but as I said, if you just Google CRDT, Center for Rare Disease Therapy, you'll find us. So let's start. And I'm gonna start with a little bit of quiz. You don't have to answer this question, though you can, I guess, if you want. This is a situation that actually happens more often than you might think in our discipline. So everyone has been talking on the internet about a new supplement. It's available over the counter from a variety of suppliers. Some families have tried it and they rave that it gives their child more energy, or more generically, it improves them. Others have questioned that effect. Doesn't seem to be much published information in the medical literature on the compound. Also fairly common for us. And so the question is, which statement best describes your feelings on trying this new supplement? There it goes. I have to try it because it might make a difference. How about I'll do some more reading and make up my mind about trying it after that? That's a pretty scholarly way to approach it, right? Maybe you'd say, I'll ask my doctor his or her opinion on trying the new supplement. They're supposed to know everything, right? They're the doctor. How about, I can't see how something like this will work, so I won't try it. Take the negative. Or how about, I would be very interested in participating in a clinical trial. Now, it probably won't surprise you, given the title of this talk, that I think the right answer, let's get it to move here. Uh-oh, Jason, we may have to go to you moving the slides. It's given up on me. There we go. It won't surprise you that I contend that the correct answer is I would be very interested in participating in a clinical trial. Let me try and click it. If it doesn't work, we'll have you do it, Jason. Yeah, it's not working for me. So next slide, please. Why is that? Why should we do a clinical trial? Because we try to practice evidence-based medicine. We don't want to be treating you on the basis of rumor, on the basis of conjecture, on the basis of one person's observations that might or might not be real. We want to do this on the best available medical evidence. Are UFOs abducting cows? There's the evidence, right? Well, not really. And how are we going to get that evidence? Let's go to the next slide, please. That evidence isn't just I think. One patient says it worked for me, another patient says it didn't work for them. Those are anecdotes. What we want is data, and the plural of anecdote is not data. We can get 100 people to tell us what they think, and unless we know that their experience has been carefully controlled, we don't know what else has gone on that might make them feel better or worse. Next slide, please. Jason, next slide, please. There we go. So what we want to do is test all of the drugs that we use and the supplements that we use to treat our patients with rare diseases in the same way that drugs have been tested for decades and even centuries now. We want to test them in a clinical trial that gives us the evidence that we need to separate out opinion from fact. Now, a few definitions to help you understand clinical trials as we move forward on this talk. We generally break levels of medical evidence down into well, I guess this is actually 5 groups. There's 3 levels there. The historic gold standard for knowing whether or not a trial works is a randomized control study, typically something that's called a double-blind placebo control. What that means is you sign up for a study, and we give you a compound. And that compound might be the drug, or it might be a placebo, an inactive a form of usually sugar or something that looks just like the active compound. So neither you can tell it whether you're on the compound or the placebo, and we can't tell. And then we look to see whether one group is doing better than the other. Now, neither of us know who is who until the study is over. And then we break the code and we say, ah, yes, this group of people was on treatment, and this group of people got the placebo, and this group did better, so the drug works. That's a double-blind placebo control, and you're randomized into that. We'll come back to that in a minute. That scares a lot of people. But we'll talk about why that's a really vital way of understanding whether drugs work or not. Now let's look at level 2. And level 2 involves some attempt at collecting information on whether a drug works, but not in a double-blind or a randomized control study. The first level, or the first subgroup in this level, are controlled trials, but without randomization. What that means is that we're giving you the drug. We both know you're getting it, but we're testing things in a very careful way, and we're having you take care of yourself in a way that is well controlled, but we're not trying to give anybody a placebo. What this does for us is it gives us at least a way of trying to separate out what happens if you both take the drug and just keep going on your way the way you were doing versus following everything else that we're telling you. And usually what you do in this setting is compare a before and after. How do you feel now based on very specific criteria compared to how you felt before you started this new drug? So that's a controlled trial without randomization. And you'll see that a lot in rare diseases. For those of you who were on either my talk on PKU or fatty acid oxidation disorders, I talked a lot about clinical trials on those. So if you're interested in some specific examples, you can go back to that list of webinars that I showed earlier, and you can see what they look like. The second subgroup in here is an attempt to look very carefully at a cohort or a group of patients, preferably more than one group, and try to sort out whether they're on different therapies and see whether one group is doing better than another. Now that's fraught with all sort of biases, and it's very, very difficult. And for every 20 of you who are out there, you're probably all doing 20 different things. So it's not as well controlled as even that first set one, the controlled trial without randomization. But it does give us some information, and we might do that, for example, as part of an early level study, or an early part of a clinical trial, to try to get some idea about what parameters would be most useful for us to include in the clinical trial. The final subgroup in level 2 is sort of everything else that involves looking at patients. Here you might see multiple groups of patients over time, some from Pittsburgh, some from Oregon, some from Texas, whatever. And excuse me, and that may or may not have an intervention. It may just be what we call a natural history study. We're just going to see, do patients in Oregon or Texas look any different from patients in Pittsburgh? The other thing that is, or the other part of this that's really plays sometimes a big role in rare disease is that somebody comes up with a great idea. This gotta work, right? I'm gonna give this a shot, and I'm gonna take a patient who has terrible symptoms, whatever those symptoms are, and I'm gonna give them this treatment that I think has to work based on hopefully something in reality. And suddenly that patient is dramatically better. Although that doesn't fall into a very high level, it actually is viewed relatively as relatively strong data when you're going to the FDA to try to get more formal clinical trials approved, and especially if you've done that several times. So that's a level 2-3. Now the final level, the lowest level, the worst kind of evidence. What is it? Well, opinions of respected authorities based on clinical experience, descriptive studies, or reports of expert committees. I hate to say this, but that's me. And I can tell you my experience in treating you for whatever disease you have, and that's just my opinion. Hopefully it's a good opinion. Hopefully I've come to that opinion by talking to other experts in the field, expert committees, and we're giving you the best we can, but it's still not very good, and it doesn't meet the level of that any regulatory agency is going to need to approve a study. Next slide, please. Oh, I had builds on that one. What the heck? Thank you for running through those. Regardless of what kind of study you do, when that study is all done, you have to come to some kind of conclusion. And those conclusions are what's called recommendations. And those recommendations are given a grade, just like you got in school, A, B, C, or D. And instead of an F, the worst level is I. That is, there's no evidence. So we just can't tell one way or another what's gone on. But those other levels are built off of the kind of studies that we talked about. Level A, there's strong evidence that benefits substantially outweigh the potential risks. That's what you want. It's the best level of the highest level recommendation you can get. And you're only going to get to that recommendation based on very strong clinical trials. So you're not going to get that on evidence on that level 3. These are going to be level 1 or maybe some really strong level 2 studies. In particular, a lot of patients who have had a dramatic response to a new drug that's been tried open label. A grade level B, not so bad, fair scientific evidence that benefits outweigh the potential risks. It's hard to really tell you what that looks like. It might be a study that was imperfect. A lot of those open label, but nonetheless controlled trials end up generating level B evidence as opposed to the double-blind trials that give you level A. And sometimes it's the best you can do. Level C is, there's data that's been generated, but we really can't tell one way or another whether the risks outweigh the benefits. It appears that there are some benefits. It looks like there are some side effects that would be classified as a risk. And so that's a toss-up. You know, the FDA is never going to approve something on the basis of level C data. You probably wouldn't want to take something on the basis of level C data. And what it says is, if there are some benefits, you're probably going to go back and try a different clinical trial to see if you can prove now in some other way that those benefits outweigh the risks. Level D, run. Don't go there. The risks outweigh the potential benefits, and you just don't want to use that compound. And then, as I mentioned, level I, which is inconclusive or lack of evidence. That's there just isn't anything that you can say based on that study. It just wasn't. It turned out it didn't give us any information that we wanted. Next slide, please. I might have a build. Oh, I got the build in there too. All right, it's probably going to be on this slide too, Jason. So the phases of a clinical trial, which is how we're going to generate ultimately those recommendations, are also stratified. Phase 1, 2, 3, and 4. Not too hard to remember. And if you look at any clinical trial, whether it's for a common disease or a rare disease, you'll see the trials designed in this fashion or designated in this fashion. Sometimes in rare diseases, they're combined. But let's talk about them individually first. So phase 1 is the very beginning. You've got some preclinical data. Somebody's done some lab studies, someone's done some animal studies, and it looks like that this drug is going to be a good possibility to be effective in whatever disease you're testing. And the first thing you need to do is figure out how much of it you have to use in people, and is there anything that happens when you give it to a person it represents a risk that you didn't see in any of your other your preclinical studies. So these are drug metabolism and dose range studies in healthy volunteers. There may be some clinical endpoints built into that. Excuse me, but the final, the real purpose of a phase 1 trial is to look at safety and not efficacy. So if you get past phase 1, we were able we didn't see any safety problems. You might have done some early dose ranging studies, and it looks okay. Now you go on to phase 2. Phase 2 are now smaller. You can think of them as pilot studies, early studies that look at a small group of patients and now translate that dose that you just found in a phase 1, or in rare diseases, this tends to be a phase 1/2 trial, we call it, where you might or you might not do it in healthy volunteers, but now in phase 2, you're treating for sure patients who have a disease. And you're still looking for safety, but now you're trying to get the earliest indication of efficacy. If you don't find any safety signals there, anything that looks problematic, and you might get a positive signal on the efficacy, or might not, but you don't see anything problematic. Now you go into the phase 3, which is ideally that randomized double-blind placebo-controlled study that we talked about a bit ago. And you're still looking for safety, but now here you're really trying to document efficacy. Rare disease trials often have a combined phase 2/3, where you start them at a lower dose and smaller population, and you work your way up. They may or may not be double-blind placebo control, but they're the best we can do for a rare disease. There are all sorts of very, very innovative ways of doing clinical trials in rare diseases that are now starting to be utilized, and the FDA is recognizing those as valid to test a drug for a rare disease. Excuse me. Now, finally, you get to phase 4, and what phase 4 is the FDA or some regulatory agency in another country has said, we approve this drug, but because it's a rare disease, the clinical trial is small, and we want you to collect more, usually safety data, but sometimes some additional efficacy data. And so the company does what's called a post-marketing study. They're gonna follow everybody who's on that drug and see how they do. It's not as well controlled. In fact, it's not controlled at all, other than they're on the drug. But now you're going to just collect that data and see how it goes. And those post-marketing studies might last a year or two. They might last 10 years. And that's a negotiation between the pharmaceutical company who's developing the drug and the FDA in the end. Next slide, please, Jason. So the whole goal here is to be able to come up with drugs that are going to help you or your child as a rare disease patient grow up healthy. Get out there and be able to run in their yard with the dog. These are my kids, long ago in a universe far away. Next slide, please. But I've already alluded that there really are some difficult challenges related to studies for rare diseases. It's a little bit like looking for a needle in a haystack. You don't really know what you're looking for when you go in. There's so much going on. And even if you do have a really good idea what you're looking at, the way to get to where you're going is not clear. I liken it to here you can see the beginning of the maze, and how we're gonna get through that maze is just not clear. We don't know, and so what you have to do is step back and try to get a different look at the problem in a way that helps you understand both the disease better and the potential therapy better. Next slide. And with that, next slide, Jason. If you take a different view of the problem than might be usual for not a rare disease, next slide, suddenly things become a little bit more clear, and you can find a way to study the drug and study the disease that you might not have thought about if you were coming at it from a non-rare disease space, as many of our pharmaceutical companies do. Many of them have rare disease arms, but their background is in non-rare disease. We have to, in the same way our regulatory agencies are used to looking at drugs where you can test 1,000 people and say how many of them did better and how many of them did worse. Well, we can't do that in rare disease for the most part. So you have to have a different way forward. Next slide, please. I like to use the childhood cancer story as an example of what you can accomplish if you work together as patients, patient advocacy groups, parents, and of course, physicians and drug companies. If you go back to the late 50s, the 60s, the childhood cancer was nearly uniformly fatal. There was, for most cancers, a less than 5% survival rate. And if you look at something like leukemia, that's exactly what it was. It was 5% survival rate. However, the overall survival rate for childhood cancer, and now and this was probably put together several years ago now, so it might even be higher than this, but at least 75%, regardless of the cancer. And if you look at leukemia, that I mentioned back in the 60s was almost uniformly fatal, it's now got virtually 100% cure rate. How did that happen? Next slide, please. Well, physicians and companies put together groups that started looking at these disorders and their treatments collaboratively. And eventually, they all merged into a single one called the Children's Oncology Group. And this is stolen off their website, and their mission is to cure and prevent childhood and adolescent cancer through scientific discovery and compassionate care. How does that work? Next slide, please. Well, so first of all, instead of there being any one center, it's a coordinated effort across the country and sometimes even internationally. And everybody works together on clinical trials. And so back then, individuals with cancer, now individuals with rare disease, start with standard of care. If you don't start with standard of care, you can't know whether your treatment is better than standard of care or not, your experimental treatment. Because if you were being treated by someone who didn't understand your disease, and now suddenly you go to a center participating in a study, and they say, oh, well, we're going to fix all of this and we're going to start you on a study. Well, you're going to look better because you got now standard of care where you weren't before. So standard of care, first thing. Now you can be enrolled in a study. You can be offered the opportunity to participate in a study where standard of care is being compared to standard of care plus one other thing. So when you participate in a clinical trial, you are not going into a situation where you might now all of a sudden not be getting the best care possible, the best care known. That's a critical distinction. The best care known. You're still going to get that, but you're going to get one other thing on top of that, or not if it's a double-blind placebo-controlled trial. And by constantly doing these trials, you prove one drug works a little bit better, now you start a second trial, and standard of care now includes that other trial because it was proven to be a little better, and something else. And with this constant feedback, iterative model across multiple centers, you can throw out the things that don't work, you can incorporate the things that do work, and everybody is better off. That's how the Children's Oncology Network did it, and it's how we can do it for rare diseases. We're not there yet. We've got lots of us out there. There are next slide, please. There are patient groups. There are study center groups. There are disease organized groups. There are companies that are pushing their own potential therapy. Here's just a number of folks that things that I'm a part of. A mitochondrial disease consortium, NAMDAC, a fatty acid oxidation consortium, Inform, a PKU Alliance. That's a family organization. That's not professionals, but they interact with professionals. We all belong. Moderna, as you probably have heard of them now because they came out with one of the COVID vaccines, but they're a rare disease company as well, and so they're trying to develop things on their own and working with groups that participate in the study of rare diseases. Next slide, please. And it's only by those kinds of cooperative studies that we're ever going to get anywhere. Excuse me. Now I mentioned that there's a little bit of hesitancy in most individuals to think about participating in a double-blind placebo-controlled trial. People think, well, I want the real drug. It won't hurt, but it might help. I don't want that placebo. Well, that's wrong. We don't know if it will help. It's a study. It may be completely ineffective, and not that we would ever bring something that we know would hurt, but it might. If a drug does something unexpected in a human that it didn't in a laboratory study or an animal study, it actually could hurt. And it might not help. So we are not withholding something from you in a double-blind placebo control. We're giving you standard of care, the best possible care available, plus one other thing. Now, some people say, well, I don't want my child to be a guinea pig. We have to respect that. You may or you may not be comfortable doing clinical trials. If you just want to do standard of care, then you should just do standard of care. No one is ever going to pressure you to be to participate in a clinical trial. But recognize that those of the patients and families in the community who are doing that are providing a service, and be supportive of them. And then finally, that last one is sort of the beginning related to the first bullet, which is to say, I want my child to get the real treatment, not the placebo. we don't know if it's a treatment. We think it's a treatment, but we won't know that until we do the clinical trial. Now, keep in mind that I've already said that some of these rare disease clinical trials may not have a placebo arm, but they're always going to have something that they're comparing, one dose to another, one formulation to another. So there's some variation of these things are always going to these questions are always or comments are always going to be in play. And all I can say is that if we knew it would help you, it wouldn't be a clinical trial. We would just use it. Next slide, please. Jason, next slide, please. There we go. And if you don't participate in a clinical trial, what's the outcome? What's the detriment to that? Why should you participate? Well, clinical trials are the only mechanism for getting FDA approval for a drug. You could think of any drug that's out there that you're being treated with. It's because it was on an FDA, it's FDA approved, and it went through a clinical trial, or you're on a clinical trial for it. Whether it's your individual physician who's doing a one-person clinical trial, that's possible, but it's still a clinical trial. What else? Well, most of our rare diseases don't have any FDA approved treatments. It's a sad fact. It is increasing, thank goodness. And there are lots more companies out there interested in these therapies, except for a small smattering of rare diseases, there aren't treatments for them. And so if we don't have patients who are interested in participating and willing to participate in clinical trials, we will have no clinical trials, and there will be no additional proven treatments or no additional diseases that get approved clinical treatments. Next slide, please. So how can you feel comfortable about participating in a clinical trial? You don't go into a clinical trial with blinders on, even though it's called a blinded study. You go into a clinical trial understanding it. You know its purpose. Both broadly, it's treating the disease you have or your child has, and specifically, we're trying to go after this particular symptom because of this particular mechanism. Here's why we think it works. The only way you're going to know that is to talk to the people doing the clinical trials. Sometimes your doc might know about the clinical trial because it's been presented at scientific meetings, and so you can also talk to your own physician. But you don't go into this with no knowledge. You have to understand the logistics of a trial. Do you have to travel? Do you have to be in a hospital? Are there any procedures that are going to be done? You're either comfortable with whatever those arrangements are going to be, or you're not. But you have to know them before you sign up. You have to know the investigators, or at least you have to be comfortable with them. You might not know me, but maybe your doctors know me, and they say, oh yeah, Vockley's a good guy, you can go to a clinical trial there. I hope that's what they'll say. But that's what you need to, you're not just going to go to a clinical trial for somebody who hangs up a shingle and says clinical trials are us. It's got to be legitimate. And then one of the absolute main components of a clinical trial is the consent. So you will spend a long time going through the consent form on a clinical trial with the study coordinator and ultimately with the investigator, the clinical investigator on that trial, to know the procedures, the perceived risks and benefits, know that you are doing this voluntarily and that you have the right to refuse or withdraw with absolutely no penalty. I mean, you can go back to your standard of care minus the clinical trial. No one is going to think the worst of you for having pulled out of it. And then finally, the issue of compensation. Clinical trials take time. They take you away from your job. And so many clinical trials, in fact, will compensate you for that. The other compensation that you should think about is if something bad happens, always a possibility. Then you have to be sure that the study will compensate you for any medical care that you need as a result of that. Bottom line, participation in a clinical trial is a partnership, and it involves mutual trust. I trust you that you're going to do what you say you're going to do following the clinical trial procedures, and you trust me that I'm not going to do something that's harebrained and dangerous, and that I'm going to look out for your best interest, not the company that's sponsoring the clinical trial. Next slide, please. So, being treated for a rare disease isn't easy, and you know that it can be a bumpy ride. Clinical trials are not necessarily easy. They can be a bumpy ride. They don't always go the way we want. We're always coming back with modifications that we need to tell you about. Here's what we're doing. Here's why we're doing it. Next slide, please. And all of these represent barriers to us being successful. But the bottom line is that even though finding a clinical trial, participating in a clinical trial, or from our case, running a clinical trial, it can sometimes feel like herding cats. Next slide, please. It's the only way to go. There are financial challenges to getting a clinical trial going. These are incredibly expensive. If you look at the average drug on the market, companies have put oftentimes hundreds of millions of dollars into developing those drugs. Many rare diseases, it's a little less than that because they're coming into it with some prior knowledge that eliminates some of the early steps. But nonetheless, any clinical trial easily is in the tens of millions of dollars. Next slide, please. But if you can navigate those barriers, if we all work together and get through them, next slide, it's a success. And the only way you can have those successes is if you just do it. Just be a part of a clinical trial, or at least help yourself to understand what clinical trials are, and think about participating. Next slide, please. I'm just going to show you some quick view of some of the folks in my lab who do some of the preclinical studies that go into some of the clinical trials that you might have heard about for PKU and long chain fatty acid oxidation disorders. Next slide. Clinical trials are implemented by a clinical research team, and this is it's a little dated now. A part of my clinical research team. Some of those folks are still here. Some of them have moved on. Next slide. Need to update that. Next slide, please. And with that, I'm going to stop. This webinar is scheduled to go to 1 o'clock. I do have to bug out at 1 because I got another one of these following. But I am happy to take questions up until then. You can do that by way of the question function on the webinar program. So if you type that in there, Deanna will look at those and bump them over to me for review. Oops. Can't see whether they're coming through here. Hang on a second. Deanna, are you looking at those chats? Actually, I see some stuff coming through here on my end. Why don't I just try to look at that? There is a question. Is there a place you can go to search for available clinical trials? Oh my gosh, I forgot to put that up there. My bad. Clinicaltrials.gov, spelled just the way it sounds, no space. Clinicaltrials.gov. You can go there. It is a trial as a site as is implied by the .gov that's run by the federal government, and every clinical trial in the United States has to be listed there. If you go there, you can search with a variety of ways. You can look for by investigator. You say, oh boy, my next door neighbor who's got the same disease says they're at a trial in Pittsburgh and Vockley's the PI. I'm going to search for Vockley. You'll find it. I've got a fatty acid oxidation disorder, one of the diseases that I do a lot of research on. I'm going to type in fatty acid oxidation disorder. You'll find it. I've got VLCAD deficiency, a specific fatty acid oxidation disorder. Type it in there, you can find it. I know that drug's made by Moderna, one of the companies I mentioned earlier. Type in Moderna, you'll find it. COVID will come up in there. The vaccine studies. So absolutely, clinicaltrials.gov, a very, very important resource for you. Obviously, you can also ask your doctor. Most of us who are involved in taking care of patients with rare disease keep an eye on this field. We periodically do that clinicaltrials.gov thing, but more often than not, we're seeing them at our scientific meetings and our clinical meetings, and we're able to let you know whether something is coming up. Any other? Oops. So some of you are asking them in the question, so I gotta look at two boxes. Let me see. Can you continue to receive I'm trying to make this bigger so I can read the whole question. There it is. Can you continue to receive the treatment after the clinical trial is over, and how long does it typically take for a drug to be approved? Old friend Kathy Stagney from the Organic Acidemia Association. Thanks, Kathy, for that question. The answer is sometimes yes, you can keep it going, and sometimes you can't. Oftentimes, the early phases, you don't require that. The FDA doesn't require that, and the company is doing really short-term studies to figure out what the right dosing is, and you go off the drug when the study is over. Later on in clinical trials, phase 2 or phase 2/3, most often there's what's called an extension phase, where you can move from the double-blind placebo portion of that, if that's what you were on, to now open label. So if you were on the placebo in that portion, you'll be moved over to active drug. Or if it wasn't placebo, everybody will just move over to whatever the extension study is designed to do. And that clinical trial can take anywhere from a couple of years to 10 years. We just got approval for triheptanoin, a drug for fatty acid oxidation disorders that I've been working on for at least a dozen years. The formal clinical trials for that were about 7 years in taking care in doing it. And I guess I can read this one. One of my patients says, "Thank you to you and your team. I'll send this out to my team for your support to a trial that I participated in. Wanted to thank you for getting me to where I am today." The rest of it's a little too embarrassing, Mindy. I'll just stop there. But she does say, clinical trial, getting through a clinical trial, the team's always there for you. So thanks for that. And it really is. This is it really is a partnership. We will never. push you into a clinical trial. Your physician will never push you into a clinical trial. We just want you to know that they are available. And if you elect to try one, it may not be where you live. You may have to travel, as I said, but we'll always work with your local team to keep them aware of what's going on through the clinical trial and help you with anything that comes up. Question: what about registries? Can we get on a disease registry, and will that mean researchers will contact us? So registries have a couple of different meanings. The more formal meaning, what that question I assume is referring to is can I put my name somewhere that says I have a disease and I'm interested in clinical trials? Oftentimes the question is yes, and the mechanism for that is very different depending on who does it. I mentioned the Organic Acidemia Association earlier. I do a lot of work with them, and they do help the folks with diseases in their purview hook up with clinical trials. Many disease-related family organizations will put you on a list. They almost never will give that list out publicly. Well, I'll say they will never give it out publicly. Usually, the way they're set up to do is that companies can go to a family group and say, here are requirements. Do you have anybody who might be interested? And if you've registered and said you're interested, then then the matchmaking occurs, and you'll get that put out you'll be put in contact with the company. The pharmaceutical or FDA clinical trial definition of a registry is a little bit different. It's actually a way of documenting your experience with clinical disease, with any disease, a rare disease, and so we have registries for a variety of different disorders, and if you participate in that registry, it may or it may not make you eligible for or get you contacted by other groups that are doing clinical trials. If it's a registry for a specific follow-up for a specific drug, that's drug and that's company specific. That mechanism won't get you out there, but your clinical team, your study team will. If you've participated in a clinical trial with me, you're on my list forever. I'm sorry, you're never getting away. If I know there's something out there that I think will be good for you, or I think you might be interested in, or I just said, look, I'm going to let you know whatever trials are available, I'm going to contact you. It won't have anything to do with the clinical trial registry that you're on. Let's see. I don't see any other clinical or any other questions at this point. So if there aren't any questions, I'm going to go ahead and conclude by thanking you for participating in this and joining me today. Do please feel free to pass this the information about this webinar on to anybody you think might be interested. If you participate in another group, you're welcome to pass on the link to the CRDT and the webinar link that I had up in the beginning. If you have any questions about specific clinical trials, you can send those on through the CRDT. We will get those to the right team here. However, recognize that that'll be us, not your local group. So we're not sending them out to geographically. If you want to find out if your group is your local folks are participating in a clinical trial, they usually list that on the clinicaltrials.gov as well. So check it out there. So thank you for participating, Deanna and Jason. Thank you for your help, and we'll hopefully see you for a clinical trial or at a future webinar. Bye-bye.